Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first Take Two clinical conversation for 2023. My name's Claire Ryan, and I'm the team leader of the Take Two clinical practice development team. We're really excited to have this opportunity to share with you, our experience and our ideas about key principles of working with infants, particularly infants who have been exposed to trauma, abuse, neglect, and family violence, and to help you guys think about how you can bring that understanding into your practice with infants and families. Let me first begin by acknowledging that we're joining from various lands today. We've got people from all over Australia and beyond Australia. I'm joining you from the the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I'd like to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and their emerging leaders as well. I'd also like to acknowledge the incredible strength and resilience of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, families, and communities, particularly during this week, which is National Reconciliation Week. So just a little bit of housekeeping as we move in. So this session goes for an hour. We've got an introduction from one of our speakers, Catherine McQueen, and she's going to talk about our new practice guide and talk to the key principles of working with infants in a trauma-informed way. And then for the second part of the session, we've got a lovely clinical presentation by two of our clinical staff, Brenda Fenton and Simone Rutherfurd, and they'll take you through a case study of a little girl that we're calling Maisie today. I do just want to stress that our clinical cases have been de-identified quite strongly, and any images that you see are just stock images. I'd also like to just flag with people that when we talk about infants, about children's and about families, particularly where infants, children and families have been exposed to adverse experiences, those sorts of discussions can evoke strong feelings in people. They can evoke memories. They can evoke sort of thoughts in your own mind about either your own experiences or those experiences of people close to you. So please just be mindful of that as we go into this session, and keep in mind ways that you can support yourself during the session, but also afterward if you need to speak to someone about what the session has evoked in you. Think about the colleagues that you can speak to, your supervision processes, and also services such as employee assistance programs. Okay, let me first introduce our first speaker, Catherine McQueen. So Catherine is a mental health social worker, and she's got postgraduate qualifications in infant, child and parental mental health. Catherine has many years of experience of working with infants, including a previous role as an infant mental health consultant with Take Two. Catherine's also worked in area mental health in a specialist infant team, and most recently she's worked as a principal practitioner for child protection. Catherine's returned to Take Two as an assistant director. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning to everyone, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all this morning. And I'd like to start by celebrating and congratulating all those who have been involved in developing the practice guide titled Principles for Trauma-Informed Practice with Infants and Young Children. It's a really important resource that's been developed as the result of 20 years of Take Two research, knowledge, and clinical work that's been undertaken by our past and present infant mental health consultants and all of our Take Two clinicians. I anticipate this will be a guide that will be a resource for all of us working with babies and young children to learn from, but to come back to and to reread many times to help us all with the thinking about and understanding the therapeutic and clinical work that we're engaging in. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the 8 core principles in the guide, and then I'll offer you a case vignette that demonstrates those core principles before we hear from Simone and Brenda to talk to us about the work they've done with Maisie. I would also like to note that Take Two define the client group referred to in the guide as 0 to 5 years, but I'm really aware that other services may define the early years client group differently. So let's not get too caught up today about defining age parameters, but let's focus on recognising the unique and rapid and time-sensitive growth and development that occurs in the perinatal and early years period. I'm going to imagine most of us sitting around the screen today who work in the field with babies and young children will all say, once we've read the guide, yes, these 8 principles are important and they're really obvious clinical principles. However, the pressure and the busyness and the complexity of our day-to-day work, along with the really powerful influences from adult practice areas, including family violence, substance use, and ill adult mental health, means it can be really challenging to ensure that trauma-informed practice with infants and young children is held central to our work. It also can be extraordinarily challenging for all of us to hear and think about and prioritise the experiences and needs of babies and young children, particularly when there are resource limits and system pressures that tend to be allocated, and system pressures that tend to lead to allocation of those resources to the louder and often crisis-driven needs of older children and adults. The trauma-informed principles are not linear concepts, but they're concepts that need to be thought about as foundational principles that intertwine together. And so in a couple of minutes, I'm going to present a small case vignette that demonstrates the challenge of talking about each principle separately. In fact, as I reflect on the case with you, it will be evident that it's impossible to consider each principle separately. In the past, it was more common for professionals and families to be surprised by the idea that even a very young baby or child has their own unique mind, wishes, needs, and experiences. But as the fields of trauma and child mental health have progressed, it is now less common for adults to be surprised by this idea, but it is still very challenging to ensure there is at least equal weight placed upon a baby or a young child's needs and experiences, particularly when decisions are being made about risk and resources and service allocation. Babies and young children mostly can't tell us in words about what has happened or what they need, but they can tell us in many other ways through their nonverbal communication and development and relationships. The therapeutic and clinical work with infants and young children requires really strong skills in observation and meaning making. And when I refer to meaning making, I'm talking about the ability to observe behaviours and interactions, and then to make sense of these, drawing on knowledge from child development, mental health, and trauma lenses and disciplines. It is also really important to have the ability to help others understand the baby or young child's experience, to be able to help them understand, to explain the baby's mind, reactions, and experiences in the context of the trauma. It can be really anxiety provoking for us as clinicians to observe and form a view about what is happening for a baby or a young child, particularly as we see their distress and reactions. We also need to be able to manage the defences or coping strategies of others that can be used to deny the infant or young child's experiences, along with protecting their own anxiety and distress. I now want to share a brief case vignette about a 3-year-old boy and his father who are having court-ordered contact following multiple experiences of family violence in the home that were perpetrated by dad, and that the care team was feeling really stuck. It seemed like contact was going okay between dad and the little boy, but they were really worried that the little boy was not making any developmental progress, despite being in a safe placement and having lots of enriched care opportunities, including at daycare. I attended the contact and undertook observations for about an hour and a half of the little boy and dad together. And I saw the little boy saying yes to dad's invitations for play and affection. I saw lots of smiles and laughter, in fact, all the time throughout the contact, even when there was nothing to smile about. I saw the little boy falling over repeatedly, and I saw him holding his arms and fingers at odd angles and were quite rigid. I then talked with the dad and the care team about the meaning of the observations. It seemed that the little boy was confused about his relationship with his dad, that there were some times when he enjoyed being with dad, and then there were some times when he was frightened of dad. Maybe he was remembering something today in contact that dad did in the past, a look or a word or a body movement that the little boy remembered today, but couldn't put into words, but his body was remembering. Dad was furious and he used denial to cope. However, the care team and the court were more able to think about the little boy's mind and experiences. They were able to hold the idea that this little boy was both loved and was frightened by his dad, and they agreed that a therapeutic intervention during contact was needed. Through the observations and the meaning making that I undertook, I was advocating and helping others to understand the little boy's mind and experiences, to understand the impact of the trauma on his sense of safety and relationships and the impact on his development. I also helped them understand the need for timely intervention and that this little boy couldn't wait. So just from this small case vignette, we can see there are almost all of the trauma-informed principles contained in the guide underpinning the assessment. Firstly, the infant has a mind. So even when this little boy was in a space where part of him wanted to be with his dad, he could still use his body and face to signal his frightened feelings and experiences. Secondly, the infant can be vulnerable to the ghosts in the nursery. So when I tried to talk with Dad about the impact of the family violence on his little boy, his reaction was really strong and he described me as the problem. And I wondered about Dad's experiences of being a little boy and being parented, and actually whether there was a link between the ghosts in his own nursery and the way they had started to show up when he became a parent. When you download or receive a copy of the guide, there's a brief video contained in the guide that's really brilliant at helping us understand why some parents repeat patterns of abuse and neglect and why some don't. And I recommend reading Selma Freiberg's full paper about ghosts in the nursery, a psychoanalytic approach to the problems of impaired infant-mother relationships. And I think someone from the clinical practice development team will put the link in the chat for you. Thirdly and fourthly, extraordinary growth occurs during the first 3 years of life, and the infant is vulnerable to poor outcomes for adverse conditions. This little boy had certainly achieved some of his milestones, and he could walk, talk, and engage in simple play. However, the exposure to ongoing family violence and the repeated stress was resulting in halted development for the little boy, particularly in the areas of his social and emotional skills and mastery of previously achieved milestones, such as toilet training. It is often hard to make sense of these things. The little boy was now living in a placement where he no longer experienced family violence, and he seemed to enjoy contact with his dad that was happening in a safe place with other adults around. However, the contact with his dad in the current format and frequency meant the little boy's stress response system was still being activated. And despite being in a safe placement and having enriched opportunities, he was not able to grow and learn and play in a way and at a pace that was needed for him to reach his full potential. Fifthly, memory occurs from conception and it is not just verbal. The little boy's reactions and ways of coping were not congruent to the interactions in the contact. There were many moments when Dad was being playful, sensitive, and was offering activities that were age appropriate. However, the little boy's bodily reactions seemed as if he was remembering and connecting sensory and relational triggers from the past, and these were creating a sense of felt threat or fear for him that neither the little boy could talk about in contact or others around him noticed at that time. 6 and 7, attachment networks are vital for good growth and development, and relationships are not interchangeable for the infant. Many times we can all get stuck in thinking that attachment networks and relationships for infants and children must be an either-or scenario. But this little boy could only have a relationship with his carer or only with his dad. And this is not true. Building and strengthening as many safe and healthy relationships as possible is the best direction across the life course for all young children, but especially for those who've experienced trauma. And this brings me to number 8, the infant can't wait. Early and timely interventions are really effective in reversing many of the effects that babies and young children experience from trauma. This is a system and service delivery challenge that we all face. Designing and implementing a service model that is able to respond in a timely manner is critical. The longer we ask a baby or a toddler in need of intervention to wait, the more likely the maladaptation to the trauma will become permanent. This little boy needed multiple interventions simultaneously, and the impact of delays in any of these interventions would be detrimental to his mental health, development, and relationships. And then finally, I want to speak about supervision. For those of you who've worked with me or currently working with me or know me through our many networks will know that I hold supervision as one of the non-negotiable and fundamental aspects of the work that we do in infant mental health. I want to speak briefly about the importance of dependable and psychologically safe reflective supervision, and that this is the cornerstone of clinical and therapeutic work, particularly when the work involves trauma, babies and young children. We all need regular opportunities to reflect on observations and engage in shared meaning making. When we engage in trauma-informed practice with infants and young children, we are required to work in a relational and deep manner with our most vulnerable and youngest clients. This can be painful and distressing and can trigger reactions and responses in ourselves that we may or may not be aware of. So to be able to fully and effectively hold our youngest clients, we must have our own holding spaces to be able to continue to keep the needs and trauma experiences of the baby or the young child in the centre of our clinical and therapeutic work. Thank you. I'm now going to hand back to Claire.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was fabulous. And I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that Jessamy has posted the link to that Selma Freiberg article in the chat thread, so you can copy that link and find it yourselves. All right, let me move on. So now we're going to hear from Brenda and Simone. Let me just quickly introduce Brenda and Simone. Brenda is a psychologist. She's one of our clinicians in our Eastern Metro teams. She's a psychologist and a clinical registrar, and she has a master's degree in clinical psychology. She's done both clinical work quite extensively, but also research. So she's a bit of a nerd. We love our research nerds in Take Two. And she's worked with infants, children, and adolescents for about 15 years. And she's also worked in residential care with Berry Street, which I would have to say is one of the hardest jobs in the world, before moving over to a clinical role with the Take Two Eastern team. Our other presenter is Simone Rutherfurd. Simone is currently the clinical team leader of the Eastern Metropolitan team. Simone is also a psychologist, and she's worked for over 25 years in clinical and leadership roles, primarily with children in the out-of-home care system. Simone is trained in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitisation reprocessing, that therapeutic modality, and also child-parent psychotherapy, which is two of Take Two's primary formal intervention modalities. Okay, over to you guys.
Great, thank you so much, Claire, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I will just test my how I go with slides here and moving them. Oh, yeah, okay, perfect, working. All right, so the case I'm presenting today, it demonstrates these practice principles that Catherine kind of went through and how that might look in our clinical everyday practice. And the case of Maisie, it has been de-identified, and the images we are using, they're stock images, but it reflects a really common referral and intervention that we might do here at Take Two. And as I go through the case, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see that when I was developing the intervention, that I leaned quite heavily on thinking about the world from the infant's point of view, and also how other people were experiencing her. And as Catherine just said, you know, within Take Two, we acknowledge that infants have a mind and a voice, and sometimes these voices can be very quiet, and one thing that we can do is give a bit of volume to it, so we can help interpret what they might be saying with their bodies or their interactions, their behaviors or their silence, and then help other people understand what that might mean. So today you'll be hearing from the voice of the toddler as well at the center of this case, who will be read by my clinical team leader, Simone. So I will give a bit of background on Maisie. So she was referred to Take Two by Child Protection at the age of 3 as part of a whole family referral. So it included her 4 older brothers. And at the time of referral, she was living with her parents and siblings. So she had been reunited. But before that, she had spent roughly a year in out-of-home care, initially living in residential care with her brothers before being moved to foster care by herself. And she had experienced some scary experiences before that. So she had been taken from her parents because she'd been exposed to neglect. So she had been left alone for quite long periods of time, and she missed out on these kind of nurturing interactions that goes along with that. So like responding to her bodily needs, like getting her nappy changed. And also there was some violence within the home. And it was suspected that Maisie had also been hurt. So the referral noted that she did have some difficulties. This included regulating her emotions, which is unsurprising given her background. So it included things like screaming or hurting others, so kicking or biting. And although we don't expect infants to regulate themselves, she couldn't regulate herself with adults either. So she found it really difficult to be comforted. And that resulted in tantrums that would kind of last for up to hours, which is so stressful for both Maisie and everybody else around her. So now we'll actually hear how Maisie experienced these events.
Me and my brothers were taken away from my mum and dad when I was a little baby. I don't know why. I was asleep when they took me away. I did not know what was happening and was very scared. I wanted to tell them to bring my Emma baby. She is my bunny who I cuddle at night, but I remember seeing her fall on the floor as I left. When I was taken away, I lived in a big house with my brothers. Lots of different adults came to the house. I liked some of them, but some were rough when they changed my nappy. I missed my mummy so much, and even though we went to visit her a lot, I never knew when we would get to see her, and no one ever told me where I was going. We spent long times in cars with different people. Sometimes they remembered my dummy, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the sun was in my eyes when we were driving, and I had to shut them because it was too bright. I really missed Emma baby. After that, I was taken to another house on my own. It was scary. There was less noise, which was strange, and I missed Mummy and my brothers more. No one knew what I liked to eat, and they always forgot my blankie. I used to make a lot of noise, hoping they would remember it. But mostly they didn't notice, so I stopped trying. One day, after a long, long time, my mummy came to get me. She grabbed me so hard I thought I would burst. It was better being home, but my brothers became louder and there was lots of fighting.
So in following a referral, we do complete pretty comprehensive assessments at Take Two to kind of decide how we're going to intervene. So starting from that prenatal period, we gather information from any relevant people in the child's life. And we do this by using interviews, observations of the child, so within whatever environments they exist in, I guess, so it could be school or at home. And we also look at their interactions with other people. And we also use clinical measures. So for example, the ages and stages questionnaires or the trauma symptoms checklist for young children, because that's to not only look at symptoms, but to measure change as well as we go through intervention. And we also will do our own clinical assessment of the child. So we might have an individual session and to see where difficulties might lie, and to do this, knowledge of what a thriving infant or child at whatever age may be is really important to understand. So generally, things we're trying to understand from that assessment is what has happened up until this exact point in their life. So to understand their life experiences, how they go with their relationships and attachments, how they're coping right now, so their current functioning, their strengths, difficulties, behaviors, any cultural or diverse factors, because that might change how we look at development, and also protective factors and what everybody wants for that child, which is really important in informing our goals, because we want to listen to not just the referrer, but the family and the people around her or the given child. At Take Two, we do have access to a lot of really helpful people and brains who can support us. So for Maisie, out of this list here, we used or we consulted with our infant mental health consultant, because she helped us tailor the intervention and how we might think of the infant in different ways, as well as our occupational therapist, because this would be very helpful in regulating her based on kind of sensory preferences or aversions. And on a more day-to-day scale, like Catherine spoke earlier, the power of supervision. So we've got us supervisors and our teams where we can discuss cases, which is really valuable given that it's quite complex families that we can work with. So there were difficulties that came out during the assessment. The main thing, I guess, in my mind was that relationship with her parents. It needed support with some repair and to help develop it a bit more. And her brothers, they were quite rough with Maisie when they were playing or interacting with her, which I kind of worried about because they were much bigger than her. And she also spent a lot of time on her iPad, which I mean, I totally get, because the parents were really trying their best and they just were doing what they knew how to do in managing those behaviors at home. At daycare, she didn't get along very well with other children, so other children were afraid of her. And playing was very stressful for her. She was quite controlling. And I also suspected that she had kind of sensory aversions to noise or really crowded spaces, which is why the occupational therapist was really helpful. And I noticed that maybe adults kind of misunderstood her behaviors. With the clinical measures that we were doing as well, it showed that she had post-traumatic stress symptoms, which related to avoidance and arousal. So in considering avoidance, she appeared quite socially withdrawn, and the arousal symptoms was kind of like she would scan the room, so she would always know who's entered the room, who's in that room, and she was kind of jumpy and flinchy when she would hear loud noises. And with symptoms like that for a 3-year-old, the intervention really can't wait. So we'll hear again from Maisie about how she experienced her life around that time of a referral.
When we went home, I got to spend lots and lots of time on my iPad. When I played with my brothers, I got hurt, and it seemed that I was always doing the wrong thing. They said I kept wrecking their game. Their faces always seemed to be frowning, and I missed the times they liked playing with me. I also started to go to daycare, but it was noisy and there were lots of strange people. Other children didn't want to play with me, and I didn't want to play with them. I liked being on my own. Every time I had big feelings, people's faces got really cross. I knew they didn't like me. I knew that I was bad and different to the other kids at preschool. I was not allowed to go to the painting corner, as once I threw the paints at the mean boy and everyone had very cross, angry faces. Sometimes I feel better by myself because then the other kids can't hurt me. I found a little cupboard. I could climb into it and be safe from everyone. No one seemed to notice when I was gone.
So when we're when considering this intervention, this slide feels quite overwhelming, but that's what it was like. So there was lots of services and professionals involved. So I found it actually quite overwhelming to conceptualize the intervention. And at Take Two, we also look at other areas beyond just therapy where we can intervene to try and improve the child's life. So to make sense of it, I looked at it from this kind of ecological perspective. So Maisie in the middle, so she's that individual perspective. Outside that is her everyday people, so her family. So that's the family unit perspective. And then outside that was pretty much everybody else in her life. So that's systems perspective. And this included people that were supporting the family. So for example, child protection or, daycare educators and the family service that kind of supported more hands-on in the home and, ourselves. And we refer to this, I guess, as the systems kind of work. So these were the three places that I wanted to intervene. We did have, sorry. We did have very specific goals for Maisie, but there were kind of overarching goals when considering all those parts of her life. So we really wanted Maisie to have consistent experiences of adults. So every day we wanted people to be attuned and responsive to whatever she was trying to communicate. Secondly, we wanted Maisie to have really positive and rewarding experiences at daycare because she spent so much time there. And it appeared to be a quite stressful environment for her. And we wanted her to learn how to play with both adults and peers. And then thirdly, we wanted to help other people keep Maisie in mind. So she didn't get lost within the system or quite simply just make sure she wasn't forgotten. So I'll talk about the intervention from those three perspectives. So in considering that individual perspective, we know that based on trauma research that child-parent relationships like child-parent psychotherapy is really effective. But sometimes we set out to do these things and it doesn't quite work out that way, especially in real world, everyday interventions. In Maisie's case, her parents were quite overwhelmed, even though we recognized they needed that kind of repair work. One had pretty significant health issues, and Maisie's siblings had considerable needs too. So it wasn't the right time for them. And they were receiving general kind of parenting support within the home, which was really, really positive for Maisie and her siblings. So because I couldn't do that child-parent work, it meant that I'd likely do a much shorter intervention because there was still things we could do. I just needed to figure out how I'd get to know Maisie, considering I couldn't do those sessions. And I needed that because if I was going to advocate for her, I needed to know her well. Otherwise, why would anybody really listen to me? So supervision was really important here for me because it helped me kind of step back and think, just because adults aren't ready, we still have to do something here because the child can't wait for other people. So in consulting then with the care team and the family, we decided really simply I'd just visit her at daycare and get to know her that way. And then, see what kind of difficulties she had, see what kind of things might soothe her or distress her, and to just give her an experience of being seen and heard, which infants sometimes miss out on. And then I would be able to keep her in the front of my mind and not rely on other adults' interpretations, because I guess we do need our own we need to use our own clinical intuition that's been built on all the experience and training, I guess, that we've gone through. So how the visits might look was that I would maybe observe her or play alongside her, especially initially because she was very mistrustful of adults, and it took her quite a while to trust me. So similar to how other people experienced her, she would like turn her body away or, grunt instead of using any words. But this made sense because for children like Maisie, when someone pays attention to them, it's really uncomfortable. It's like a child who wants to be or has been invisible. Once they're made visible, it's really, really uncomfortable because it's so unfamiliar. So I introduced activities that we could do as trial and error within the daycare to see if there was things that could help her, regulate, or things that she would enjoy. So really getting to know her. And that could include things like using different types of sensory things like slimes or clays, or different types of movement, like, swaying with different kind of rhythms, or, dancing, which is really fun and expressive. And she seemed to have really poor self-esteem too. So I was very careful to model my language around adults, which quite simply, it might be a sentence like, "Oh, I had a fun time playing with you today. I really enjoy spending time with you because you make things fun," which is really simple, but these messages can help change the internal view that she would have of herself, which often we see is this kind of thing of like, I'm unlovable or I'm unlikable. So it takes quite a bit of repetition for them to think otherwise. It also helped me keep her informed. So things that we often forget to say to kids, especially kids that don't reciprocate or respond to us. So in terms of the family unit, again, this is somewhere we would like to intervene, but the parents weren't quite ready. So we did have monthly check-ins to work on specific worries they might have had with Maisie. And I had weekly contact with the family service that kind of helped in the home. And they could kind of pass along messages, I guess, or use activities that we had trialed at daycare and help with replacing, say, iPad time with other relationship-based activities. So really the bulk of the work was going to be with the systems. So there was things that kind of maintained her difficulties within that system. So she got the least attention from, so she was a very small part of this system. She got the least attention in care teams or with all the professionals involved. But that was really easy for me to kind of work around because I could regularly see her, so I could advocate and be her voice. The problem was often seen as sitting with Maisie too. So descriptors used was, maybe she was defiant or angry or controlling, hard to build a relationship with, which are really powerful descriptions to use for a 3-year-old, which sounded like she was really misunderstood. And thirdly, not everybody understands what trauma looks like. So we don't expect people to, but when we don't understand it, it kind of maintains difficulties because she's not getting the response she needs. So we often wanted help with like discipline or consequences, but that's not how, I guess, we respond to trauma. So we wanted to kind of move away from these consequences to more preventative work and wanting her environment to be safe, structured, predictable. So to help with that, a lot of psychoeducation was used, and there were some key messages that stuck because I think they were kind of sad. So Maisie found carefree play really difficult, and it didn't come naturally to her. So she adapted to all the stressful experiences in her life by trying to create a sense of order, which might be really controlling during play. Another message that kind of stuck was that she didn't see adults as comforting or safe. And this made perfect sense based on what she'd been through. But when we are often rejected consistently by a child, it's disheartening, or people might stop trying. So it made sense that she was described as difficult to build a relationship with. And lastly, avoidance once helped Maisie survive. So she couldn't physically protect herself as a young baby, so she would stay small and hidden to avoid threatening situations. But that survival mechanism in a different context, such as daycare, was really unhelpful. So we would implement a lot of strategies at daycare, and it might be looking for patterns, triggers, trying to anticipate her needs, trying to figure out what might regulate her. For example, she loves so small spaces, so daycare got a tent, and that was really containing. And then something we could also bring into the family home too. Structures, routines was very important here too, and also like calendars, so she knew what was going on. And this also was helping rewrite her template of what adults can be. So just thinking about time, I might just move on to some challenges and learnings that we had from this intervention. So it was hard for people to move away from expecting Maisie to be fixed, expecting her to be able to behave better, and then understanding that it's actually their interactions that needed to kind of to shift and change. And this takes that responsibility of recovering from trauma off of a child and then back onto the adults. Also, kind of like what Claire mentioned earlier, where she gave a bit of a context warning about what we're going to talk about. When we increase empathy and talk about these things with adults that don't normally work with children that have been hurt, it can be quite distressing. And, you know, people might take on too much responsibility or feel quite distressed and burnt out. So it's important for us to understand that too. And in Maisie's case, to support that, we would do some reflective sessions with the care team and also her daycare. So even though we didn't get to work on that key parent relationship, there were things about that did change. And it was down to Maisie getting multiple doses of this attuned, responsive caregiving every single day from so many different adults. She started turning towards rather than away. She would seek comfort, not always, but she would sometimes seek comfort from adults. She did have reduced post-traumatic stress symptoms, which was really, really positive. So she was more comfortable and settled in her day-to-day life. Her care team also was more attuned because more attention was put into thinking about her, and their language actually started reflecting like how I was speaking, which is so positive for Maisie, because if she doesn't exist in other people's minds, like any infant, they couldn't exist at all. And the system was also better able to just hear her voice, and she didn't mind being visible anymore, which was really, really rewarding, even though, I mean, as psychologists, we're not supposed to gain from anything, but it was really rewarding to see this. And then, so now actually we'll hear from Maisie about how that felt like for her.
Things are better at my house. Mummy's face is not cross and angry all the time. Now, if I have mixed up feelings and want to hit mummy, she says things like, I think you're trying to tell me you need some mummy time. And actually, she's right. So she gives me a hug or plays a game with me. I have a tea set at home now and I make pretend coffee for mummy, which makes her smile. That makes me feel good. I like my mummy more now. At daycare, they found out how much I love to dance. And when we do crazy dancing, everyone's faces are more smiley. I don't need to go to my cupboard at all now. Even though I still have big feelings from time to time, I know that the grown-ups in my life can help me.
So I finished working with Maisie now at this stage and her family, and they do still have a lot of work to do. But her future is much brighter, and she's starting kinder next year. And now that her care team really understand her, they'll be able to then advocate, when new people come back into her life, even though she's the smallest and quietest member of the family. So hopefully this case has been helpful, and the practice guidelines can really help you keep an infant in the center of your own minds, so then you can keep them in the center of their own worlds too. So yes, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Thank you, Simone, and thank you, Catherine. That brings us to the end of our presentations. Please, like I said at the start of the session, please look in your inboxes next week for the Relate e-newsletter, where you'll get links to the content from today and our new practice guide. And as you will have seen, Jessamy popped in the chat thread, we do have other practice guides. So if you go to the, look on the Take Two website and search for practice guides, you'll find a series of those. For those of you who are interested in doing a bit of a deeper dive into looking at the way that Take Two works with infants and actually developing, perhaps learning some new content for yourselves and how that might apply to your own practice, we have a one-day workshop that we deliver via Zoom. We've just very recently delivered it, but we'll be delivering it sort of on a public basis again on the 31st of October. So just have a look on the Berry Street website for how to register for that. We can also deliver that to individual sort of organisations or teams on a as required basis. So please contact us via the Take Two email address, which again you'll find on the Take Two webpage. All right, I think that brings us to the end. Thank you everyone for your attendance and participation. I kind of kept an eye on the chat thread. Okay, sorry, I've got an issue with my headset, which is driving me crazy. Yeah, I didn't notice any emerging sort of comments or themes that we needed to respond to. So I'm seeing very much that people are very grateful. So look, go forth and listen to and be curious about the voice and the experience of the child. And we look forward to seeing you all at future events. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.